Thank you both of you for being with us. Where are you both located currently? Where are you broadcasting from?
Currently, I am broadcasting from Connecticut. I'm visiting my early retiree parents, actually, in Connecticut, but I do live in North Carolina right now doing a residency at UNC Children's Hospital.
So that is, by the way, that is my alma mater. So I spent,
Wow.
that's where I graduated from. So I'm
Okay,
a Tar Heel. There we go.
Got
So,
it.
but you were at the Catholic University though currently doing
Yes,
your PhD, correct?
exactly.
Okay. Finishing.
Yep.
How much time until you finish the PhD?
It's right around the corner. Graduation will be in May, and then you can call me Dr. Pallathra.
I love it. I love it. All right. Well, and Ted, you're at University of Pennsylvania.
That's right.
Are you in Philly or where do you live?
Yep, I'm in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. That's where I live and that's where I work.
Gosh, it's because I'm from Lancaster, Pennsylvania. Like probably an hour and a half to your west, or I'm near Lancaster. But when I was a kid, I used to drive into the city and go to Philadelphia Phillies games and Eagles games. And I do still remember the cheesesteaks. And obviously there's the Gino and the Pats and everything. But, and I haven't had one of those forever. There's one place in Atlanta called Woody's Cheesesteaks that is a very much just kind of like that. It's amazing food. But this week on CNBC, a company called, I believe it's Goldbelly.
Okay.
Goldbelly is kind of like a national Grubhub, and they're supposed to be able to deliver your favorite food from any place in the world. Like you want Kansas City barbecue at your house 24 hours, Texas brisket at your house 24 hours. They even brought up Philadelphia cheesesteaks, and I was thinking, how do you deliver a cheesesteak in 24 hours? How can that still be good?
Yeah.
So I looked it up. I guess they deliver them frozen without the cheese, so you have to apply the cheese.
Okay.
So it's not soggy.
Well, don't tell my kids, or else we're going to be ordering from that like on a regular basis. So.
Well, you guys are already in Philly, so you can Grubhub at least the cheese sticks, right?
No, I mean from other places in the country.
Okay.
The grass is always greener, right?
It really is. So guys, thank you for being. Give me a little background. How did you guys connect? And I want to obviously talk about missing each other. The book project that you guys have launched and have worked on together. How did you guys meet, and how did you want to collaborate on this topic?
Ashley, do you want to tell the story?
I love telling our story. So we met a while back at the University of Pennsylvania. So I was there for undergrad, and I met Ted working in his social neuroscience lab, doing research there, and then ended up working after college with him on a clinical research study. So we were developing a program for autistic adults to help facilitate social connection and, general social functioning, since that's something that is quite difficult for a lot of people on the autism spectrum. So our research and our clinical work.
It's difficult for people it's difficult for everybody.
That is the theme of the book. Yes. So part of our work together, we sort of realized that a lot of the things that we were studying and developing were, applicable to ourselves. And then we knew that it would, resonate with a lot of other people as well.
So Ted, you were in the social neuro lab were you both in the neuro lab?
Yeah, I'm a faculty member, and so when Ashley was in college, she started working in my lab, and then continued for a few years after that in my lab before grad school. So I'm still there in pretty much the same lab. Ashley's moved on to bigger and better things, but
so why don't we start with that? Describe to me, and I've over the years I've interviewed people in your field, psychologists, psychiatrists, therapists, and I think back into their clinical days when they were researching, and we always think of clinical research. I think first, particularly after coming out of a pandemic, you think, oh, we're testing things like vaccines, like we're trying to figure out what exact titration or the perfect molecules. But you guys do this with people. And I think, can you kind of describe how you even do a study like this? You draft, 100 people, 200 people, and then can you just, for our audience, describe a neuroscience research study and kind of the mechanics of getting everybody together, collecting the data, starting with the thesis, trying to figure out how it's going. Can you kind of walk us through that? It's fascinating to me.
Yeah, sure. I think it depends. There's lots of different kind of subfields of neuroscience, so it depends on the kind of thing you're doing. Sometimes you're doing brain imaging and looking at what area of the brain becomes active when you do this or do that. And that's one kind of study. This kind of study that we were doing was, like Ashley said, to try to develop a program for adults on the spectrum with social functioning. And this was a very new area of research, like not a lot had been done. So we were really starting from the very beginning, building something from the ground up. So basically we looked around in the research literature, we saw what had been done, maybe for other groups of people, and we basically created our own program, putting together elements of different things we found. We came up with a protocol, like first they'll do this, then they'll do this. We can tell you about it if you'd like. And then we got what's called Irb Approval. For every institution, there's an institutional review board that makes sure you're doing things ethically. And we recruited people. We put out ads and we recruited adults on the autism spectrum and had them go through this program. And the key thing, the difference, I guess, between just regular clinical work and clinical research is that with the clinical research, you're making measurements and you're trying to determine whether something is changing, something's getting better. So in our case, we were measuring changes in social functioning, changes in behavior. And it's not easy to measure. That's a whole other conversation.
That seems like the tough part, right? So it is it's somewhat subjective. You've got to say, give me an example. Like, how would you say this particular subject is now creating a better connection with someone else? So how would you measure that?
That's a great question. You're right. It is somewhat subjective. What we tried to do is use measures that are both subjective. So in other words, self-report questionnaires where the people would fill out information about themselves, how they felt they were doing. Then we also included informant report questionnaires. So we would have, with their permission, of course, but we would have someone else who knows them well, like a parent or a sibling or a spouse, fill out something about them. Like, how does that other person think they're doing socially? And then we also included, you could say, more objective measures in some sense, that we had them come into our center and engage in conversations with someone they didn't know well and videotape the conversations, again, all with their permission. And then we had raters who would rate various aspects of how they were doing in terms of their ability to engage socially. So basically, we tried to get a lot of different perspectives, from the person's own perspective, other people's perspective, et cetera, and put it all together. And I would say it's still a work in progress. We're still actually doing the next iteration of this study.
So what was the thesis here of this particular experiment? What are the traits that allow someone to make social connections? So tell me about what was your thesis on this particular study?
So the study, I think one of the most important parts of this study in particular was the fact that we were developing a program that, with the purpose of it being disseminated within community mental health centers or within broad spaces where people might not have high levels of training. So you might not need a full psychologist or a psychiatrist to be able to deliver this. And I think that, from like a public health standpoint, is really important, because a lot of clinical research, what happens is you test different programs and treatments, and it can take, more than a decade sometimes for it to reach the actual community and the broader population. So we were really, that was one of our main focuses. But then in terms of the program, application, I think we were trying to target a wide range of things. We were sort of thinking about it, social connection, as the combination of being able to manage your emotion, so regulate anxiety, regulate, other extreme emotions in order to stay connected with someone, being able to develop those skills that you need for communication. So verbal communication skills, nonverbal communication skills were things that we also targeted in terms of practice. And then, the third arm was sort of thinking about how do we help people generalize these skills towards the different areas of their life that are going to be most applicable. So whether that's trying to get a job or trying to make friends or trying to develop a better relationship with their spouse, we wanted to make it as applicable as possible.
Well, then let's go to, so you've been studying this in various capacities, social connections. How do we do this as humans? It's not, even for the most socially adept humans, it's not always easy, and not everyone's our friend, and we don't connect with everyone. And it really is, I guess it's obviously a real science, but what is the inspiration behind Missing Each Other, the book? What did you guys set out to do and teach the world in Missing Each Other? Maybe Ted, I'll go back to you.
Sure, yeah. It really grew out of that study we've been talking about, because as we were working on this for adults on the spectrum, just like you're saying, Wes, we started to think, this isn't just for people on the spectrum. This is for any of us. Like, pretty much all of us can struggle sometimes with social connection. And there's a lot of loneliness and feelings of disconnection in our society, and there's a lot of conflict and so on. So Ashley and I, while working on this research study, we thought, maybe there's a book in here for the general population. And I think the essence of our message is that social connection is really complicated, but we want to try to make it a little bit better understandable, break it down, and give some suggestions about how you can improve your skills, so to speak, or get better at this.
So again, this is all of us. This is humans, right? That we have difficulty being in tune with ourselves first. Secondly, trying to pick up on cues or understand how someone else is feeling, or how they're in tune with themselves, or and I guess is that so those are two big obstacles that we all have. Is that correct?
Yes, I would say that's correct. And it might be helpful to give you a brief summary of the framework we put forward in the book, because I think that's going to get at some of these questions. Is that okay?
Sure, please do. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And maybe I'll start it off and then let Ashley, we can sort of tag team it. But what we argue is that the essence, when you boil it down, the essence of human connection, or at least a really key part of human connection, is what we call attunement. Which we define as this ability to be in tune with yourself and another person over the twists and turns of an interaction. And interaction could be a conversation like we're having now, but it could even be other things, playing sports on a team with someone, or dancing with someone, or playing music with someone. So this fundamental ability to tune into yourself and the other person and what's happening between you. And we break that. So that's a really complicated quality, right? Like, who could even describe what's going on between us now, how we tune into each other? It's really complicated. Or how two, basketball teammates moving down the court are able to kind of know what, how do I know what I'm doing? If I'm playing basketball with Ashley, how do I know what I'm doing, what she's doing, what's happening between us and all the other people on the court? It's really, really complicated. So we break it down into these 4 parts. We call it relaxed awareness, listening, understanding, and mutual responsiveness. And we have, in the book, we have a chapter. We have a chapter in general on what is attunement. And then we have a chapter on each of these 4 key elements of attunement and what goes into them, what they are. And even we provide at the end of each chapter exercises for trying to help people to develop each of these. And then, our hope is that then you put it all together. It's kind of like, just to go back to basketball for a second, it's a little bit like learning to play basketball from the beginning, right? Like, we're not going to go from 0 to Michael Jordan instantly, unless you were, I don't know, insanely talented, I guess. Unless you're Michael Jordan.
Unless you're MJ, right.
Right. But,
unless you're Michael Jordan.
But like, most people, when they're learning basketball, start by breaking it up into parts. Like, first you learn to dribble, then you learn to pass, then you learn plays, you do shooting drills, and then ultimately you put it all together into a fluid sequence that you can apply in a game. And so that's kind of how, in our clinical study with the adults on the spectrum and in the book, we're trying to approach it by breaking it down into sort of bite-sized skills that you can work on and then ultimately put it all together in an interaction.
Okay, so attunement, it is complicated, right? I mean, how is that different than emotional intelligence, or is emotional intelligence part of attunement?
I think it's part of attunement for sure. We talk about elements of emotional intelligence, like being able to read cues, being able to understand someone else's perspective, and knowing that other people have perspectives that are different than your own. Those are all elements of emotional intelligence. I think attunement is more of like an, overarching umbrella. It's kind of like the essence of what you feel. Like if you could, for a second, imagine a conversation or imagine a situation where you just felt so in sync with somebody. You had a conversation where you were like, sometimes it can even feel spiritual on a level where you feel like this person gets me. I really get this person. We're in it. We're on the same wavelength. Like it can feel like a flow state, that ephemeral feeling. And I think that's what we're sort of talking about. It can be in a conversation. It could be as fluid as two people dancing, right? It's like when you really are following one another in a well-coordinated way, and it feels good. It's magical. It's beautiful. It doesn't happen all the time. And I think what we talk about in the book is that, like, it doesn't happen all the time, but like you were saying, it's a muscle that you can develop and grow and be able to experience more often.
So I think about it this way. I think of this example. I had in this past week, I had 2 conference calls. They were with the same. Let's just think of this. I had 2 conference calls scheduled for. It's a large group out of, let's call it, Texas, and it was such a big group that we kind of gave the whole body, let's call it 50 folks, 2 options. We can meet on a Zoom on a Wednesday at, let's call it, noon, or a Thursday at noon, and we ended up with 2 separate groups, same exact topic that I was supposed to talk about, same exact topic. And the first group ended up with, let's say, 30 people, and the second group ended up with 10 people. So on a Zoom, as you can imagine, 30 people isn't great, right? It's different than a meeting with 30 people. If you have a Zoom with more than a few people, it's hard for people to really interact. Mm-hmm. The second group was smaller. So first of all, I was probably less relaxed on the first time because it was the first time I was going through this presentation. It was hard for me to listen, and it was it was harder for me to understand how the group was feeling. So that whole, I would say I walked away from that thinking, it was pretty good, but not great. Mm-hmm. The next day, I did the same exact presentation to almost the same group of people, but it was much smaller. So I was way more relaxed. I could hear the group because they were more open to talking because there was a few people as opposed to a giant group of people on Zoom. And I really was, it felt like this magical flow. So I walked away from that as thinking that was one of the best hour-and-a-half interactions I've ever had on a Zoom call. And it was almost identical. But it felt like what you're describing here is that second one was a much higher level of attunement. I was totally in tune with them, mm-hmm. and they were totally in tune with me. And I think about how you guys kind of break this down was think about being relaxed in a social presentation or interaction, playing sports, playing music, doing a presentation. Relaxation really is an amazing first step. So, and then understanding and listening and being able to actually hear people as opposed to having words go right in one ear and out the other. So I guess I've felt this sense of attunement, but we don't get it all the time. So tell me how to have that every single time, guys.
I wish I could tell you that.
And let's go back to the Dalai Lama. So I know that in the book you write about this quality of connection and how, from the perspective of the Dalai Lama. Let's go there first. Talk to me about that.
Yeah, I mean, in the book, we start out the book with some examples of people who do this really, really well. I mean, partly for inspiration and just as an example of what we're talking about. So we start off the book with this story about the Dalai Lama. There's a professor, Bob Thurman, at Columbia in New York, and someone asked, and he's very close with the Dalai Lama, and someone once asked him, like, have you ever seen the Dalai Lama perform a miracle? Like, hoping that they would say something like really crazy, like, you know, he levitated or he cured someone of some terrible illness. And Bob Thurman wasn't quite sure what to say. And then his wife, Nena, stepped in and said, yeah, I've seen him perform plenty of miracles. And the guy got even really more interested. But what she said is, he's a very busy person and he meets with people all the time. But in all the meetings I've seen him in, he always gives each person his complete attention, even if it's just for a moment or two. It's like he's completely tuned in and focused on that person. And it's miraculous, you know. And I think the person who asked the question was a little bit disappointed because it didn't sound supernatural, but yet that ability to really focus, even when you're busy and you're tired and you're harried and you have a million other things going on, just take that moment to really tune into another person. She found to be miraculous. So I think none of us is going to be perfect, maybe except maybe the Dalai Lama, but none of us is going to be perfect at this all the time. And that's one of the big themes of the book, is that, you know, we're not asking people to try to be perfect or be perfectionistic, but it's more like what you said, Wes, that, you know, no matter where you are in terms of your natural ability to connect with others, we think that there are ways to work on this to get better at it, at least some of the time. And even a small, relatively, what seems like a small improvement, even just some of the time, can really pay off in your life. You know what I mean? Like, if people in your life, whether it's people you don't know well or even people really important to you, feel like, wow, we just really had a moment there where we really connected. Maybe not every minute of the day, but we had like Ashley said, like, we had a few moments there where I felt like we got each other. That can be really super valuable, like transformative even.
So how did you end up with, let's go through the four again. So relaxation, listening, understanding, and the fourth in the book is mutual, what was the fourth?
Mutual responsiveness. Yeah.
Responsiveness. So how do we get better at these? I mean, give us maybe a little bit of a prescription overview of how do we get better at social attunement. You know, I think about our audience who is figuring out a way so that they can stop full grinding work maybe a little sooner, right? It's our theme on, you know, a mission on Retire Sooner podcast is to help 1 million people retire at least 1 year sooner. Ironically, when we started this a year ago, I don't think we accounted for what the pandemic would do. And we had something like 3 million people actually retire sooner than they would have thought, all within a year. So we tripled our goal for the Retire Sooner podcast, but I don't think it really had a lot to do with us. It just had to do with the natural state of the economy, people getting fed up with their jobs, realizing, oh, wow, I have enough money, I'm going to retire. So we had this massive wave of people retiring early. It just so happened to coincide with the Retire Sooner podcast. Maybe we'll take a little bit of credit for a few people, but who knows? But let's think about that, where that really tough transition, we tend to think, oh, if I have the money side of retirement figured out, and I've got my, you know, we have multiple kind of foundational money items that people, checkpoints you kind of need to get to, a certain amount of liquid net worth so that you can produce income, multiple income streams, getting rid of a mortgage. These are kind of just the money foundations of being able to stop working. But the other side that is equally as difficult, it's probably more difficult because the prescription isn't as defined. With money, we know I need to have at least X amount. 500,000 is a bare minimum for early retirees. You could argue that the number needs to be higher as inflation goes through the roof in the United States. You could argue that, hey, you need to get rid of your mortgage at some point. There's a formula to do that. You need to have multiple streams of income. It's very clear what you need to do. Socially, when I say, look, you're going from having this purpose, this great meaning of work, you have all these social connections because you have this team, and then you go and you no longer have the team, you no longer have the dignity of your work, you no longer have your purpose. It's really tough for a lot of people, even the happy retiree group. It takes a lot of effort to continue these social interactions and continue social connectedness. So tell me how we could maybe get better at that under your umbrella of attunement, going through those steps, relaxing, listening, etc.?
Yeah, I'll get us started with relaxed awareness. So that's kind of like the foundation of all of the skills, all of the pillars. I think it goes back to what we already mentioned, which is being able to be in tune with both yourself and the other person that you're trying to connect with, right? We think of it as like both a mind and body situation. And so in a transition like you're talking about, your mind has been in all sorts of areas, all sorts of places, trying to focus on this one goal for so long. And now all of a sudden you're in this new place, right? And so it's almost like sometimes I think people I've heard feel like it's full stop. It's like a shock. What do I do? And so one of the elements of relaxed awareness is taking stock of yourself. And we do this, like in the book, we talk about exercises related to mindfulness meditation. We have steps describing a simple breathing exercise, for example. But I think, what we think about in using these exercises is something simple that you can practice yourself to get a sense of how you're doing, what are the emotions running through you, what are the areas that your brain is focusing on. But then being able to build up on that and using those skills, not just with yourself, alone on a yoga mat in a yoga class, but being able to take that skill with you in conversation. So we sort of explain how you can then use that breathing exercise when reconnecting with your spouse or reconnecting with your older children who you haven't had as much time to like sit down and be with, right? And that can bring up a whole host of emotions of like, what do? I haven't done this in so long. You might feel anxiety, you might feel fear of like not feeling that same connection. There's a lot running through people, and it can look so many different ways. So I think that number one step of taking stock, you did that yourself, right? In your Zoom conversation, you were more relaxed, you were able, and that opened you up to being able to hear better, to listen better. So I think that first foundational piece is where we start.
Relaxed awareness and being in tune with yourself. And I think that part of it maybe is the harder part, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is that how do you get in? It takes maybe some time to get in tune and rediscover yourself. And I think that we have millions of people in America that are, 10,000 people a day retire in America, or 10,000 people in any given day have to kind of go through this really big life transition, and they have to kind of get in tune with their new version of themselves to some extent. And that's tough.
For sure. From my personal experience, my parents actually retired fairly early in like their late 50s, early 60s, and they sort of had this new exciting phase of life. But on the other hand, it was also daunting. They had been working so hard. They had been, had a lot of stress that is no longer there, but then that sort of fills your brain with like, well, shouldn't I be stressed? Shouldn't I be harried? Shouldn't I be doing something? Shouldn't I be, my dad's constantly like, I need to find another project to do. It's almost like we don't even know how to relax and be in tune with what's going on with ourselves and the other person. So for sure, it's a transition. And I think one of the first things to do is start to develop and cultivate self-compassion and knowing that it's not going to be immediate.
So what does that even mean? What is self-compassion? Is that me being nice to myself, Ashley?
Yeah, we all say, at least in the psych world, right? We all have our own inner voice. We talk to ourselves constantly. Our mind is on always, most of the time. And I think we're not even like aware of all the things that our self-talk is saying. Sometimes it's super negative, sometimes it's more positive. But I think relaxed awareness also gives you a sense of, when I'm trying to have a conversation with my spouse, am I, by doing a simple breathing exercise and checking in with yourself during that conversation, you start to develop this muscle of being aware of, is my mind racing to other things while I'm focusing here? Am I, feeling really anxious about something else? That's a really hard skill to do because we are moving constantly.
This is getting back to being in tune. It's really, really understanding kind of what you're saying about the Dalai Lama is really being able to understand what the other person is saying, and I guess in being in tune with yourself too. Which this is so much deeper than what I write about in my book. Whereas I'm thinking, in my mind, it is just stay super busy like your dad. Have 1 million projects. Have 47 core pursuits. Start a YouTube channel. Just keep busy. Keep totally engaged with 30 other things.
And you can. That's what some people are going to need. And I think but I think for others, it might take a while to figure out what that is going to look like for you. And so knowing that it doesn't have to be immediate, there is no one right answer. It doesn't, I think you probably out of everyone know that there's no blueprint that everyone follows that's exact. And
it is a unique fingerprint for every single family, every single person in the world, and every American that ends up going this journey of being able to retire. They all get there in a different way. So there's not one exact formula for having financial success. Mm-hmm. And then when you transition into retirement, there's no exact perfect blueprint for people either. So what you guys approach this really in your book, that Missing Each Other, you approach this, I think, fundamentally even deeper than how I've always approached this. And this is what I appreciate about what you're bringing to the show today. So Ted, what about listening? How can we be... So hopefully I'm relaxed. Hopefully I'm in tune. Mm-hmm. And does that just help me be a better listener, or can I train myself to be a better listener as well?
I think you can train yourself. So relaxed awareness is this, what we call this foundational state of mind and body that then gives you a foundation to be a better listener. Because if you're not so tense and distracted and harried, then you can actually focus more. You can focus on the other person. And I think one of the things we talk about in the book, which you guys have sort of been talking about too, is becoming a better listener in the sense of listening to the other person. And when you're retiring, I think, during those really busy work years, you were probably really distracted by 1 million things. And I know myself, my email inbox, and the boss wants you to do this. But so this could be an opportunity to really invest. And sometimes that wears away at our relationship. So when you retire and you have some more time, maybe you could make one of your priorities is,
43,000 emails. Oh my God.
Wow. That even dwarfs me.
We all do, right?
Right. So
we're going to talk about that after the show.
Yeah, I know. The idea of thinking this is an opportunity as I retire to really, I'm going to try to listen more. So, whatever time I have with my kids or with my spouse or whatever, can I just lay other things aside and even for 5 minutes, really just try to listen to them? And I think that can do wonders for your relationship. And I think, like we've said, it's a muscle, it's a skill that you can practice and get better at. And for some people, we're also distracted by our devices, like the 43,000 emails. And so for some people, it's hard for 10 seconds to stay focused on what someone else is saying. Mm-hmm. But I think you can, just like building up the number of reps you do with a dumbbell, you can say, I'm going to make it a minute this time, where I really try to focus on the other person. And one of the things we also talk about is, as you're focusing on the other person, sort of checking in with yourself, too, not completely losing sight of yourself. And one thing about the retirement thing I was thinking is this idea of taking stock, listening to yourself and thinking to yourself, I'm my own person. What do I need in retirement to make it fulfilling for me? Am I the type of person that I've always what I've really wanted to do is just be out on the golf course all day long and I'll be happy as a clam if I do that? Or am I the type of person who, I need some sense of purpose and mission? And even if I'm not going to be as busy
to lower your golf score. Yeah.
Yeah. Even if I'm not going to be as busy as I was in my work life, is there some purpose that some cause or something that I've been really interested in. Like maybe could I do some volunteer work that I would find meaningful and would give me a sense of purpose. And interestingly, that's one of the things we worked on in our intervention for adults on the spectrum was we had this element of volunteer work. So anyway, that idea of listening to yourself.
By the way, Ted, the number one core pursuit, which I talk about in my book, What the Happiest Retirees Know, I call core pursuits are a really important piece of the equation. I compare happy and unhappy retirees in my research, and the happy group ends up with at least 3.6 or almost 4 core pursuits or hobbies on steroids. And if you dive deeper into what those are, I'm of the belief that it doesn't matter what they are as long as you have them. It really doesn't matter. However, I do keep track of them, and the number one and the most popular core pursuit that shows up in the happy HROB group, Happiest Retirees on the Block, the happy group, is volunteering. So that is interesting because it is an activity, but it also it really sends a purpose. And so I appreciate that as an example. So tell me though, so then again, this kind of flows into the thought of if I'm relaxed and then I'm listening, I guess I'm also, it's just easier to be understanding, Ashley. So now I can understand you if I'm really hearing you.
Well, that's the hope, but there are a lot of things that get in the way of being able to understand someone. So I think if you are relaxed, like you're saying, if you're being able to regulate yourself and whatever's going on for you, being more in tune with the other person, you're ideally going to be able to interpret what they're saying accurately. But I think one of the things to keep in mind as you're reinvesting and redeveloping relationships is to know that people are always evolving and changing, and people are dynamic. And so even if you've been married for 45 years, you are still, the value in going into with humility of feeling like there's always still things to learn. There's always still things to understand about someone, and not going in with assumptions. I think sometimes that helps with understanding other people, taking stock of your own biases or your own maybe mood or emotions in the moment that might be filtering what someone is saying and kind of skewing, your interpretation of what they're saying. So there are a lot of different kind of, I think, dynamics that can make understanding difficult. But I think as long as you are, trying to be really conscious of taking stock of, am I interpreting this right? Asking questions, even like summarizing, reflecting on what someone said to be able to get their take on, is that what you're trying to say? Is that, am I getting that right? Kind of thing. That sort of piece is, I think, part of it.
As we wrap up today, can you just think of one parting thought around someone that's going through a transition? So we're trying to help people understand to get into this transition. We're either moving jobs or going to a less phase of work, so lower work, maybe go from full-time to part-time. Maybe we go from full-time, we call that the retirement gray zone, or just I'm done. And you really are fully doing a full stop on work. What would you suggest, Ted, as a parting thought for people making that transition?
I think that, when people reach towards the end of their lives and they look back on regrets and things like that, it's what they wish they had invested more in was relationships and some sense of meaning. And that meaning doesn't have to be with paid work. I mean, it could be with something else that's important to you. And maybe it's relationships itself. So I think that as people are making a transition and they have a little bit more time in their schedule, they will really benefit tremendously by investing more of themselves into improving the quality of their relationships.
And I like that reminder too, Ted, because it's easy for me to be able to work all the time. And I can justify that easier in my head. It's just easier to always say I'm always doing something, always productive, always working, always providing for the family, always growing the business, always growing the podcast, always growing something. And one thing I think my research actually taught me, and that's why I think these podcasts are really just to remind me of how to live a better life. And it is great to talk to people like you guys as a constant reminder that you have to make the prior. So I actually, the way I think I've shifted my mind about a decade ago of this is that as I really started to dive into this research is that I don't look at these relationships. I try not to. I can easily slip away from this as a nice to have, a reward. Of course, when I get the time, or it would be nice if I could reward myself with social time. I look at it as an absolute must, because I know if you don't have it, and I know it takes time, it takes effort. It's easy to just work all the time and do kids all the time. But if you don't prioritize and say, well, my life is going to be totally worthless if I don't carve out time that is for social, and maybe I'll start thinking now of social attunement, but relationships at the end of our life and meaning, number one. Ashley, what do you think is a parting thought here today?
Sure. I think for people who are going through a transition like you're describing, one thing I would encourage you to think about is what we know from research is that we are terrible estimators of how we're going to feel in the future. And so when we go into a new situation, we're often consumed by fear of what it's gonna be like. And the data show that what we do is we overestimate how negative that experience might be, or overestimate the potential negative of what it could look like, and we underestimate how happy we might be with this new change. So just taking stock of that idea and thinking about the fact that you might be underestimating how great this new transition might be for you. And hopefully, it brings hope to people as they start something new.
I really like that. I mean, you may be underestimating just how happy you're going to be in the future. I think we leave it at that. So Ashley Pallathra.
Yes, sir.
Ted Brodkin, thank you so much for your work, your book, Missing Each Other, and this deeper level beyond what I've talked about here on the Retire Sooner podcast, this deeper level of how to have this social attunement to make our social relationships better, which is not a nice to have, but a 100% must have to be a happy retiree. So thank you guys for joining the Retire Sooner podcast.